Stay with me, because what you're about to hear sounds like a mistake, until you realize it was a man destroying his own future in real time. The polished marble floors of Bennett Tower reflected the city skyline like glass, but Olivia Bennett barely noticed as she steadied herself, one hand resting gently over her 7-month pregnant belly, her breathing slow, controlled, practiced, the way her doctor had taught her when stress tried to take over, because stress was dangerous now, and she knew it. Even if the man standing 10 feet away from her clearly didn't care anymore. Ethan Caldwell adjusted his cufflinks without looking at her, his voice low, sharp, impatient, the same tone he used in boardrooms when someone disappointed him. "You shouldn't be here, Olivia," he said, as if she were an inconvenience, not his wife, not the woman who had stood beside him when his company was nothing more than a rented office and a dream, and for a moment, just a moment, she wondered if he truly didn't remember, or if remembering simply didn't matter to him anymore. Behind him, Madison Blake shifted slightly, her heels clicking softly against the floor, her expression calm but her eyes calculating, watching Olivia the way people watch something already replaced, something already gone, and Olivia felt it, that quiet dismissal, that invisible line being drawn, but she didn't respond, not yet, because she had learned that silence often revealed more than words ever could. The digital clock on the far wall ticked down in bright red numbers. 47 minutes until the signing, 47 minutes until the $50 billion contract that would define Ethan's career, save his company, secure his name among the most powerful men in the country, and he had no idea how close he already was to losing it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Madison said softly, her voice smooth, almost sympathetic, but there was no warmth in it, only strategy, and Ethan nodded as if her words carried more weight than anything Olivia could say, as if the life they had built together had already been rewritten without her. Olivia's eyes drifted past them, landing on the massive screen inside the glass-walled conference room, where the Bennett Global logo rotated slowly in anticipation of the signing, a quiet, elegant symbol that most people in the building recognized instantly, but not everyone understood, and certainly not Ethan, who saw only opportunity, never origin. Her fingers brushed against the thin bracelet on her wrist, a simple piece of silver with an engraving so subtle most would miss it. But not everyone, because across the lobby, a security officer straightened slightly, his gaze sharpening for just a fraction of a second, recognition flickering before discipline returned, and he looked away, and Olivia noticed that too, every detail, every shift, because she had been trained her whole life to read rooms like this, rooms where power didn't shout, it waited. "After today," Ethan continued, finally meeting her eyes, "things are going to change." And the irony of that statement almost made her smile, but she didn't, not yet, because the truth didn't need to be rushed. It had its own timing, and somewhere above them, behind private doors and silent elevators, a man who had built empires without ever raising his voice was already on his way down, and Olivia knew that when he arrived, nothing in this room would remain the same. The red numbers on the wall shifted from 47 to 46 minutes, and somehow the air in the lobby felt thinner, like time itself had started pressing down on everyone in the room, and Olivia could feel it in the way conversations lowered, in the way assistants moved faster, in the way even the polished silence of Bennett Tower carried a quiet urgency that most people would never notice but she had been raised to recognize. Ethan checked his watch, his jaw tightening slightly, not from fear but from impatience, the kind that came from believing everything was already under control, and he turned back to Madison as if Olivia had already disappeared from the equation. "Make sure legal is ready," he said, his voice clipped, efficient. "I do not want any delays when Bennett Global signs." And Madison nodded with a small, confident smile, the kind of smile that came from thinking you were already on the winning side. Olivia watched them for a moment longer, then shifted her weight carefully, one hand still resting protectively over her stomach as the baby moved gently, a quiet reminder that not everything in this moment was about contracts and power. Some things were still real, still fragile, still worth protecting, and that thought grounded her more than anything else could. "You really think they will sign with you?" she asked softly, her voice calm, almost curious, and for the first time Ethan paused, just slightly, as if the question caught him off guard, not because of what she said but because she had said anything at all. "They have no better option," he replied, turning fully toward her now, his confidence returning instantly. "We are offering the best numbers, the best infrastructure, the best future." And he stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal without actually being kind. "This is how the world works, Olivia, something you never really understood." And Madison's soft laugh followed, light but deliberate, reinforcing every word he had just said. Olivia held his gaze, steady, unshaken, and for a brief second there was something in her expression that did not match the woman he thought he knew, something deeper, something older, something that did not belong to the version of her he had already dismissed, but Ethan did not notice, or perhaps he chose not to. Because acknowledging it would mean questioning himself, and that was something he had not done in a very long time. Across the lobby, two men in tailored suits stepped out of a side corridor, their movements precise, their eyes scanning the space with quiet authority, and several staff members straightened instinctively as they passed, a subtle shift in posture that spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. But Ethan was not looking in that direction, he was too focused on the future he believed was already his. Olivia noticed them immediately, of course she did. And her fingers brushed lightly against the bracelet again, the engraving catching the light for just a moment, and this time the same security officer from earlier did not look away as quickly, his gaze lingering just a fraction longer, enough to confirm what he had suspected, enough to change everything even if no one else realized it yet. "After today," Ethan continued, his voice gaining strength as if he were already standing on the other side of success, "you will not have to worry about anything anymore." And the irony settled into the space between them like a quiet echo, because he truly believed he was offering her security, stability, a future built on his success, never once considering that the foundation he was standing on had never belonged to him in the first place. Olivia exhaled slowly, her eyes drifting once more to the conference room where the Bennett Global logo continued its silent rotation, waiting, patient, inevitable, and somewhere above them, the private elevator began its descent, unseen, unheard by most, but very real, carrying with it a presence that would soon turn certainty into silence and confidence into consequence. The elevator chime was almost too soft to notice, just a quiet sound tucked beneath the hum of conversations and the distant rhythm of footsteps, but Olivia heard it, and more importantly, she felt the shift it brought with it, like the entire building had taken a breath it did not realize it was holding. The private doors at the far end of the lobby slid open with controlled precision, and two additional security personnel stepped out first, their posture unmistakable, not aggressive, not rushed, just absolute, the kind of presence that did not ask for space but naturally commanded it, and one by one, people nearby adjusted without being told, moving subtly aside, lowering their voices, straightening their jackets as if something important had just entered the room. Ethan did not turn immediately, still mid-conversation with Madison, his attention fixed on logistics, timing, numbers, because in his world, those were the things that mattered, those were the things that defined success, and he had spent years believing that if he controlled those variables, he controlled everything. "We cannot afford any missteps," he said firmly, glancing toward the conference room where assistants were now arranging final documents. "Once they walk in, everything needs to be perfect." And Madison nodded, though her eyes briefly flicked past him, catching a glimpse of the movement behind, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her expression before she masked it again with composure. Olivia did not move, did not announce anything, she simply watched as the man who had built empires without ever needing to raise his voice stepped into view. Alexander Bennett carried no visible urgency, no dramatic entrance. Just a quiet certainty that seemed to reshape the space around him, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable, his presence unmistakable to those who understood what real power looked like, and as he walked forward, the distance between him and Olivia closed slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had adjusted to his pace. A few executives near the reception desk froze for half a second before quickly regaining their composure. Whispers barely audible began to ripple through the edges of the room, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to signal that something significant was unfolding, something that would not be undone once it fully revealed itself. Ethan finally turned, more out of instinct than awareness, and for a brief moment, his expression did not change, because recognition had not yet reached him, but something else did, something subtle, something instinctive, a shift in atmosphere that even he could not ignore. And his eyes followed the line of movement until they landed on Alexander. "Who is that?" Madison murmured under her breath, her voice no longer as certain as before, and Ethan frowned slightly, searching his memory, searching for context, because men like him believed they knew every important face in every important room, and the fact that he did not immediately place this one created a crack, small but undeniable, in the confidence he had been carrying all morning. Olivia lowered her gaze briefly, her hand resting again over her stomach as the baby moved, calm, steady, as if even that small life understood that something larger was about to unfold, and when she looked back up, her eyes met Alexander's for just a fraction of a second, no words exchanged, no gestures made, just recognition, quiet and complete. The digital clock shifted again, 45 minutes remaining, and yet everything about the moment felt like it had already crossed a line that could not be reversed, because the truth was no longer waiting in the background, it had arrived, and whether Ethan realized it or not, the version of the future he had been building was already beginning to slip out of his hands. The distance between them closed slowly, but every step Alexander Bennett took seemed to carry more weight than the last, not because of force but because of certainty, the kind of certainty that did not need to announce itself. And as he approached the center of the lobby, conversations faded completely, replaced by a silence that was not empty but observant, as if the building itself was paying attention. Ethan straightened instinctively, adjusting his jacket, his posture shifting into the version of himself he presented to powerful people, confident, composed, prepared to negotiate. Because even without full recognition, he understood that this was someone important, someone who could not be ignored, and that instinct had carried him far in business. But instinct alone was not enough in a room like this. "Mr. Caldwell," one of the assistants near the conference room said quietly, stepping closer with a folder in hand, her voice careful, respectful, "Bennett Global representatives have arrived." And for a fraction of a second, something flickered across Ethan's face, something that looked like anticipation mixed with relief, because this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment everything would come together, the moment his years of ambition would finally be validated. Madison's expression shifted as well, her earlier confidence returning as she leaned slightly toward Ethan, her voice low, encouraging. "This is it," she said, as if she had been part of building this future all along, as if Olivia had never existed in the equation. Olivia remained where she was, still, composed, her breathing steady, her gaze following Alexander as he moved closer, and when he finally stopped a few feet away, he did not look at Ethan first, he looked at her, just for a second, a brief, quiet acknowledgement that carried more meaning than any introduction ever could. Ethan noticed it, of course he did, and confusion settled in more clearly now, because the pattern was not aligning with his expectations, not with the way these meetings usually unfolded, and yet he pushed the thought aside, stepping forward with his hand extended, his voice smooth, practiced. "Ethan Caldwell," he said, confident again. "We appreciate Bennett Global taking the time to meet with us today." And Alexander shifted his gaze to him, not dismissive, not impressed, simply measuring, as if evaluating something that had already been decided. "Do you?" Alexander replied, his tone calm, almost neutral, but there was something beneath it, something that made the simple question feel heavier than it should have, and Ethan hesitated for just a fraction of a second before recovering, offering a polite smile. "Of course," he answered. "This partnership represents a significant opportunity for both sides." And Madison nodded subtly beside him, reinforcing every word. The digital clock changed again, 44 minutes remaining, but time no longer felt linear, it felt suspended, stretched between what Ethan believed was about to happen and what was already set in motion. Olivia shifted slightly, her hand brushing the bracelet again, and this time Alexander's eyes followed the movement, not because he needed confirmation, but because he acknowledged it, the symbol, the connection, The truth that had been standing in front of everyone the entire time without being seen. Interesting, Alexander said quietly, his gaze returning to Ethan. And what exactly do you believe you are being offered today? And the question hung in the air, simple on the surface but layered with something deeper, something that suggested this was not a negotiation, not really, but something else entirely, something Ethan had not prepared for, and for the first time since the morning began, his answer did not come immediately, because somewhere beneath his confidence, a realization had started to form, faint but undeniable, that the outcome he had already claimed in his mind might not belong to him at all. For a moment, the question seemed simple enough that Ethan almost smiled, because this was familiar territory, numbers, projections, strategic positioning, the language he had mastered over years of relentless ambition, and yet something about the way Alexander Bennett asked it made the answer feel heavier, as if the words themselves were being weighed before they were even spoken. We are being offered a long-term infrastructure partnership, Ethan said, his voice steady, confident, returning to the rhythm that had carried him through countless negotiations. $50 billion across multiple phases, with projected expansion into international markets. And he gestured lightly toward the conference room as if the future was already waiting for him inside, as if it was already signed, sealed, secured. Alexander listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his posture relaxed but precise, the kind of stillness that suggested control rather than passivity. And when Ethan finished, there was no immediate response, just a brief silence that stretched slightly longer than expected, enough to shift the balance of the moment without anyone raising their voice. Madison stepped in smoothly, sensing the need to reinforce, her tone polished, professional. We have prepared detailed projections and risk assessments, she added. Our team is fully aligned with Bennett Global's expectations. And she smiled, a calculated expression meant to signal readiness. Partnership, certainty. Olivia watched the exchange quietly, her gaze moving between them, not with tension but with clarity, because everything unfolding now felt inevitable, like a sequence she had already seen before in a different form, in a different room, years ago, when she had first learned what it meant to sit across from people who believed they understood power without ever truly holding it. The digital clock shifted again, 43 minutes remaining, and yet the urgency that had filled the room earlier had softened into something else, something quieter but more decisive, like a door slowly closing without anyone noticing. And what makes you believe? Alexander said finally, his voice calm, almost conversational, that this opportunity was ever yours to define. And the question landed differently this time, not as a challenge, not as a negotiation tactic, but as something closer to a statement, something that reframed the entire premise of the conversation. Ethan's expression tightened just slightly, the first visible crack in the composure he had maintained all morning, because the logic did not align with his expectations. The structure of the conversation had shifted in a way he had not prepared for, and for a brief moment, uncertainty surfaced, small but undeniable. We were selected based on our performance, he replied, a touch more firmly now, as if reinforcing his own belief. We met every requirement, exceeded every benchmark. And he glanced toward Madison, who nodded in agreement, her confidence returning as she leaned into the narrative they had built together. Olivia took a slow breath, her hand resting over her stomach again, the steady movement beneath her palm grounding her in the present, reminding her that this moment, this turning point, was not just about contracts or companies, it was about truth, about identity, about the quiet line between what people assume and what actually is. Across the lobby, the security officer who had noticed her earlier shifted his stance again, his attention now more deliberate, more focused, and two other staff members near the reception desk exchanged a quick glance, subtle but telling, as if pieces of a larger picture were beginning to align. Alexander's gaze moved briefly toward Olivia once more, then back to Ethan, and when he spoke again, his tone did not change, but the weight behind it did. Performance matters, he said, but alignment matters more. And he let the words settle, not forcing them, not explaining them, allowing their meaning to unfold in the silence that followed. Ethan frowned slightly, trying to interpret, trying to Regained control of a conversation that no longer followed the rules he understood, and for the first time, he was not entirely sure what came next, because somewhere beneath the surface, the realization was no longer faint. It was growing, that this was not a meeting he was leading, not a deal he was securing, but something else entirely, something that had been set in motion long before he ever walked into this building, and the outcome was no longer his to claim. The silence after Alexander's last words did not feel empty, it felt deliberate, like a pause placed with intention, and for the first time since the morning began, Ethan did not immediately fill it, because something inside him had started to shift, not fully formed, not fully understood, but present enough to disrupt the certainty he had relied on. The digital clock changed again, 42 minutes remaining. And the number seemed louder now, more visible, as if time itself had begun to measure something different, not just the countdown to a contract, but the unraveling of an assumption. Alignment, Ethan repeated, slower this time, testing the word as if it might reveal its meaning if he handled it carefully. We are aligned with every requirement your team outlined. And he gestured again toward the conference room, toward the documents, the projections, the months of preparation that had led to this moment. We built this proposal specifically for Bennett Global. And his voice held on to confidence, but it no longer carried the same ease. There was effort now, a subtle tightening beneath the surface. Madison stepped closer, her presence supportive but strategic, her tone softening as she added, "We understand your standards," she said, "and we are prepared to meet them at every level." And for a moment, it almost sounded convincing, almost complete, like a narrative that should have held together, if not for the quiet contradictions standing just a few feet away. Olivia shifted slightly, her posture still calm, still composed, but there was a clarity in her gaze now that had not been there before, or perhaps it had always been there and simply had not been seen, and she looked at Ethan not with anger, not with accusation, but with something more final, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Across the lobby, more subtle movements began to align. A receptionist straightened and stepped aside, another security member adjusted his position, and a senior executive near the conference room door lowered his voice mid-sentence. All small changes, barely noticeable on their own, but together they formed a pattern, a quiet reordering of attention that pointed in one direction. Alexander noticed none of it outwardly, or perhaps he noticed all of it and chose not to acknowledge it, because his focus remained exactly where it needed to be, and when he spoke again, his tone did not rise, did not sharpen, it simply settled more firmly into the space between them. "You prepared for a transaction," he said. "But this was never just a transaction." And the distinction landed with precision, not dramatic, not forceful, but undeniable. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, the pieces no longer fitting into the structure he had built, because every answer he gave seemed to move him further from clarity rather than closer to it, and that was unfamiliar territory, uncomfortable in a way he could not easily correct. "Then what is it?" he asked, more directly now, the first real question he had asked all morning, and there was something honest in it, something that suggested he was finally beginning to understand that he was missing something essential. Olivia's fingers tightened gently around the bracelet, the engraved symbol catching the light once more, and this time Alexander's gaze followed it without hesitation, without concealment. Acknowledging it not as a detail but as a fact, a truth that had been present from the beginning. The digital clock shifted again, 41 minutes remaining, and yet the outcome no longer felt tied to time, it felt tied to recognition, to understanding, to a realization that was arriving slowly but could not be stopped. And as Ethan stood there, waiting for an answer he could still control, the reality he had not yet accepted was already standing beside him. Quiet, patient, and no longer willing to remain unseen. For a fraction of a second, no one moved, not because they did not know what to do, but because something in the room had shifted beyond routine, beyond protocol, and even the quiet hum of the building seemed to fade. As Ethan waited for an answer that no longer felt simple, Alexander studied him without urgency, as if time itself were no longer a factor, and when he finally spoke, his voice did not rise, did not harden, it simply became unmistakably clear. "It is alignment of values," he said. An alignment of character. And the words settled into the space with a weight that numbers could not match. Ethan blinked once, processing, recalibrating, because this was not the conversation he had prepared for. Not the language he had expected, and yet he forced a small, controlled smile, the kind he used when negotiations took an unexpected turn. With respect, he replied, choosing his tone carefully. Our performance record speaks for itself. And he gestured again, almost instinctively, toward the conference room, toward the data, the projections, the tangible proof of everything he believed mattered. Madison nodded beside him, her confidence returning in subtle layers. We have built this company from the ground up, she added. We know what it takes to deliver at scale. And her words carried conviction, but there was something underneath now, something thinner than before, as if certainty had begun to lose its foundation. Olivia remained still, her gaze steady, her expression calm, and when she finally took a step forward, it was not dramatic, not sudden, just deliberate, and the movement drew attention in a way that words had not, because it shifted the focus of the moment without asking for permission. Ethan noticed immediately, his expression tightening slightly, irritation flickering beneath the surface. Olivia, this is not the time, he said quietly, his voice controlled but firm, as if he could still place her back into the role he had already assigned to her, the role of someone outside the decision, outside the outcome. But she did not stop, and that alone was enough to disrupt the balance he had been trying to maintain. Her hand rested lightly over her stomach. As she moved, steady, grounded, and when she came to stand just a little closer, not beside him, not behind him, but in her own space, the difference was subtle, but it was there, unmistakable. The security officer near the entrance shifted again, this time not hiding it, his posture aligning with hers rather than with Ethan, and one of the executives near the conference room door lowered his tablet slightly, his attention fully redirected. Alexander's gaze followed Olivia without hesitation, and for the first time since he entered the room, there was a trace of something more than neutrality in his expression. Not emotion exactly, but recognition acknowledged openly. The digital clock changed. Again, 40 minutes remaining, and yet the number felt almost irrelevant now, because the moment had moved beyond scheduling, beyond contracts, into something that could not be reversed once it was fully revealed. Ethan exhaled slowly, his patience thinning, his control slipping just enough to show. We can handle this later, he said more firmly now, his eyes fixed on Olivia, as if the solution was simply to delay, to postpone, to keep the structure intact until the deal was secured. Olivia looked at him then, directly, her expression unchanged, but there was something final in it, something that did not argue, did not plead, did not negotiate, and in that silence, the truth that had been waiting just beneath the surface began to rise, not loudly, not dramatically, but inevitably, like something that had never needed permission to exist in the first place. The moment did not explode, it settled, quiet and precise, like a final piece sliding into place, and when Olivia lifted her gaze again, there was no hesitation left in it, no uncertainty, only clarity that had been waiting patiently for its turn. Ethan watched her, his expression tightening further, because something about her silence now felt different, not passive, not uncertain, but resolved. And that shift unsettled him more than any argument could have. Olivia, he said again, lower this time, more controlled, as if lowering his voice could restore control over the situation itself. Step back. And the words were not loud, not harsh, but they carried an expectation he had relied on for years, the expectation that she would listen, that she would yield, that she would remain in the space he allowed her. But she did not move, and in that stillness, something invisible broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change everything that followed. The digital clock shifted again, 39 minutes remaining, and yet time had already lost its relevance, because the decision was no longer waiting to be made, it had already been made, it was simply waiting to be seen. Olivia's fingers rested lightly on the bracelet, the engraved symbol catching the light once more, and this time she did not lower her hand, she did not hide it, she simply let it remain visible, undeniable, and across the lobby, the same security officer took a single step forward, not toward Ethan, not toward the conference room, but toward her, his posture aligning with a different authority entirely. Madison noticed it too, her confidence faltering just enough to show, her eyes moving quickly between the bracelet, the security officer, and Alexander, as if trying to connect pieces that refused to fit into the narrative she had been so certain of just moments ago. "What is going on?" she murmured, not loudly, but no longer controlled, and Ethan heard it, even if he did not fully understand it yet. Alexander stepped slightly to the side, not to take center stage, but to clear the line of sight, and in doing so, he shifted the focus entirely, not toward himself, but toward Olivia, as if the moment did not belong to him, as if it never had. The executives near the conference room door straightened instinctively. Their attention no longer divided, no longer uncertain, and one of them adjusted the tablet in his hand, the Bennett Global logo still rotating quietly on the screen behind him, waiting, patient, unchanged. Ethan's gaze moved from Alexander back to Olivia, searching now, not dismissing, not controlling, but searching for something he had missed. Something that would restore logic to a moment that no longer followed any pattern he recognized. "Explain this," he said, and for the first time, the words did not sound like a command, they sounded like a question he did not want to ask. Olivia met his eyes, steady, calm, and when she spoke, her voice was not raised, not sharpened, it was simply clear. "You said this was about alignment," she said, her tone even, her words measured. "You were right." And the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything that had been said before. The silence that followed was not confusion, it was realization beginning to take shape, slow but irreversible, and as the room adjusted around that truth, the structure Ethan had relied on, the assumptions he had built, the certainty he had carried into this building, all began to shift, not collapsing, not yet, but no longer holding the way they once had, and in that quiet turning point, the contract, the company, the future he had been so certain of, all stood suspended, waiting for a truth he could no longer ignore. The words did not echo, they settled, and in that quiet space, everything that had been uncertain began to align with a clarity that could no longer be dismissed. Ethan stood still, his gaze fixed on Olivia, but this time he was not looking at her as an interruption, not as a distraction, he was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. As if the version of her he had carried in his mind no longer matched the reality standing in front of him, and for a brief moment there was no response, no immediate defense, just the weight of realization forming in silence. The digital clock shifted again, 38 minutes remaining, and yet no one moved toward the conference room, no one reached for the documents, because the outcome was no longer tied to schedule, it was tied to truth, and that truth had already begun to surface. Alexander did not step forward, did not take control, because he did not need to. The moment was not his to dominate, it was hers to define, and his presence simply ensured that it would be recognized. Olivia exhaled slowly, her hand still resting over her stomach, steady, grounded, and when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but there was no softness left in it, only certainty. "This was never just your deal," she said, her eyes holding Ethan's without hesitation. "It was a decision made long before you walked into this room." And each word landed with precision, not raised, not forced, but impossible to ignore. Madison's composure finally cracked, her expression tightening as she took a small step back, her earlier confidence dissolving into something uncertain, something that could no longer find its place in the narrative she had believed in, and her eyes moved quickly, searching for reassurance that was no longer there. Ethan swallowed, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly, the confidence that had carried him now replaced by something heavier, something closer to understanding. "What are you saying?" he asked, and this time there was no authority in the question, only the need for clarity he could not avoid. Olivia's fingers lightly touched the bracelet once more, not as a signal, not as a reveal, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something that had always been part of her, something she had never needed to prove, and as she lowered her hand, the room seemed to follow the movement. Every detail aligning toward a truth that was now fully visible. One of the executives near the conference room stepped forward slightly, his voice careful, respectful. "Mr. Bennett," he said, addressing Alexander, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Olivia, as if seeking confirmation, and Alexander gave the smallest nod, not introducing her, not announcing her, simply affirming what had already been understood. The silence that followed was not confusion, it was acceptance, and in that acceptance, the structure of the moment shifted completely, because the authority in the room had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but absolutely. Ethan's gaze returned to Olivia, and this time there was no dismissal left in it, no control, only the recognition of something he had overlooked, something he could not undo, and the weight of that realization settled into his expression as he stood there, no longer certain of the future he had claimed just minutes before. Olivia held his gaze for one final second, then turned slightly, not away in anger, not in retreat, but in conclusion, as if the conversation had already reached its end without needing anything further, and as she took her first step toward the conference room, the path in front of her opened without hesitation, not because she demanded it, but because it had always belonged to her. Behind her, Ethan remained where he was, surrounded by the same marble floors, the same glass walls, the same numbers still counting down, but none of it meant what it had meant before, because some men spend years building a future they believe they own, only to realize, in a single quiet moment, that it was never theirs to begin with.